Well, welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. My guest today, he sent me his fair sort of resume earlier, and I immediately thought of Voltaire. And more specifically, Voltaire's quote, and stop me if you've heard this before, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now, if you swap out the word God for Renaissance fair, I think you have a prime example in my next guest, who is Steve Aultman. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Can you begin to explain why I thought that you were God in Voltaire's speech?
No, I don't think so.
Well, it occurred to me as I was going through your pre-fair existence that you had already done a lot of immersive interactive theater, and that if the fair had not existed, maybe you would have had to invent something like the fair for your personal enjoyment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's very flattering. Thank you. Yeah.
Like at UCLA, you took over, was it the education classroom, and did a model UN based on Lord of the Rings?
I was not the creator of that. I was a participant. I actually read about it in the UCLA student newspaper and just sounded right up my alley because I already loved the Lord of the Rings and this Model UN. I've heard of Model UNs. They were generally very serious and based on real world stuff. But I love the idea that this one was based on Middle Earth. So sign me up. And it was a great experience. I did it 2 years in a row. And the first year, they didn't know what I brought to the table. And I kind of got in kind of late. So they assigned me Fanghorn Forest. And I came up with a costume, a wearable tree costume, decorated it with wood grained tree bark, fiberglass stuff. It was removable. So I had, you've seen somebody, the Chiquita Banana song, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So it was this cardboard cylinder that fit around my torso and covered my face. And I had big eyes because Fanghorn is supposed to have big eyes, right? And deep eyes. And I needed to be able to see out it, but they were big and they were wide in this cardboard tube. It was covered with this fiberglass, that tree grain. It was actually originally designed for tripping out the back of your van, believe it or not. And then little cardboard tubes from like used up aluminum foil rolls and stuff like that. All that was covered with that fabric. And then I could cut out little green and yellow leaves and tack those on. And then I put a little bit of window screen to keep the bugs out. I grabbed that trick from Disney characters, right? To cover the eyes so I couldn't be seen. And then I put on a long sleeve brown shirt and stuck that through the armholes. And I had long brown corduroy pants on that stick out the legs so I could walk. Doug Garfinkel, who was one of the organizers of that event, he was so amused. And because it was a long event, they invited me to take off the tree and they gave the tree its own delegate badge. So the Fanghorn Forest was the only entity represented at the Middle Earth Model UN that had 2 delegates that day. But I had a lot of fun, costuming and creativity. That was in me at the get-go. It was just not fair yet. It was there.
Do you remember your first character costume and what was the context you wore it in?
At the fair or?
No, before the fair.
Before the fair. Prior to having this interview, we talked about some other things via chat, and I told you a little bit about LARPing, live action role playing, and how it didn't exist until my friends and I got together at UCLA and invented it. It may be like calculus, where it got invented in more than one place at pretty much the same time. But back there in 77, I want to say, we invented LARPing right after that Middle Earth Model UN you were talking about. And as I was kind of getting prepared for that, we started thinking about costumes. And I mentioned that I loved heraldry. We cut out a wooden shield, painted heraldic devices on them. And so those might have been some of the first costumes I made.
I remember playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I would always like to be neutral good. What was your general favorite slant as a character?
I liked to play elves. When I read Tolkien, I kind of two takeaways at that young age. It was like, oh, I loved elves and I loved wizards, but I was way too young. I didn't have the beard then that I have now. It was there, but it was wispy. My friend Athene Mahalikas likes to play along with the suggestion that I've always had a beard from like very early age. So elves and wizards, and then later on that, as I got older and mellower, I started identifying with hobbits more.
I know we're taking a long time to get to the fair, but I noticed you also did wilderness journeys.
Well, that was the name of the live action role playing event that friends of mine that I met at the UCLA Computer Club and at the Middle Earth Model United Nations, that Mark Sellon, and was where I met Mark Sellon too, and Rick Israel and Doug Garfinkel and several others. Those worlds collided. That my friends from the UCLA Computer Club and from the Middle Earth Model UN, the Computer Club guys had done trick and trap car rallies. I don't know if you've ever heard of those,
No,
but
what are those?
this was the San Fernando Valley, and car culture was thriving. And there's car rallies where people go prove what a cool car they have. But this was a clever game where somebody would design a set of clues. Those clues translated into directions for driving your car to a destination. And those clues were full of tricks. So you had to be very careful how you interpreted the clues and execute the instruction set that way. And so you can see why this kind of game would overlap a lot with computer scientists. You're interpreting instruction set and you're executing it. And if you execute it flawlessly, you go to all the checkpoints, you get credit for stopping at each of the checkpoints, and you arrive at the appropriate destination first. Penalties are taken for missing a checkpoint, and there were people at each checkpoint kind of signing you in when you got there. So we did several of those, and those were all designed by friends at the UCLA Computer Club. And we would drive around the valley proving that we could execute these complex instructions. It was fun, and it was from an age before the climate crisis when you could drive around all day or all night and not feel guilty about it.
I think my sister might have done some of those things because she remembers playing a very early online version of Dungeons and Dragons with the computer cards. You fed the cards into the wall, and then long pieces of paper would get spat out.
Yeah.
And you are in a tavern, and then you had a series of choices you could make, and you had to punch your own card to feed it into the machine so it would give you a personalized response.
Yeah, lots of ways to go before we got into truly immersive experiences. But one of the fun things about Dungeons and Dragons, especially in the early days, was that your imagination was a key component of the fun, right? And that's just like that's theater too, right? Not all theater shows you everything. They invite you to co-create. That was a phrase that Tolkien really liked. You are a co-creator of your experience, whether you're imagining what you're reading in your head, you're visualizing it in your head, which is why a movie can never satisfy everyone, right?
Right.
Right, because you're helping. Your suspension of disbelief is really,
and the way you perceive the environment is different than everybody else's perception. Yeah. It's not being fed to you.
Which is why we get into so many arguments about Peter Jackson's interpretation of The Lord of the Rings around my house. I'm a fan of Jackson's. I actually have a poster that he signed for me hanging in the office here. So,
well, the McLaughlin sisters are very much pro Jackson.
Not that I can't quibble with some of the choices.
Right. You can't quibble. What's the point? And never has New Zealand looked so good.
Oh, it's on my bucket list. And Lori has already agreed to go there once she retires too. So I retired. I'm a little older than Lori, and I retired sooner. When she gets, and she's got a very wonderful career going, she's going to see that to its logical conclusion. But as soon as she's through, we're picking up and we're going to Matamata, going to Hobbiton.
And what is she doing? What is her career?
She's the vice president at Lucasfilm,
Oh,
and
very cool.
she does all kinds of stuff for them. Her title technically is vice president of finance, but she's really kind of a, multi-purpose tool, maybe is a better choice.
Okay.
She's a generalist and she put her MBA to good use. I just thought of something. One of the really fun things she just did was help design and realize the Lucasfilm campus at the Presidio in San Francisco. The old campus was gorgeous, wood paneling and arts and crafts style furniture, and just lavish and lush and wonderful. But it had gotten to be kind of old, and there have been reorganizations and all. So the company was smaller, and the space there at the Presidio was reduced in size. And so she supervised a remodeling project that made it look like you were on a spaceship. She worked with a museum exhibit creator or design team, and they put a timeline of all of George's and Lucasfilm's events that as a guest of Lucasfilm, you can walk through this timeline and you can see models that they've used back back before CG took over everything, props, droids all over the place. It's just gorgeous.
I recently resaw a movie on TV called Elysium, where they had sort of a futuristic world created in CGI and a living on Earth hell that was created by the prop guys and the model guys. And now it serves as sort of a side-by-side comparison.
Well, let me respond to what you were just saying. I mean, think back to 1977 when Star Wars Episode 4 came out, before we knew it was Episode 4. What made it brilliant? Spaceships are dirty. Androids move around and they get sand in the gears and carbon scoring on your land speeder or your spaceship. And, the future isn't all shiny and bright. The future is lived in. George just really hit it out of the park when he did that. Just a
I have
thought.
another question for you. Again,
Sure.
the pre-fair years. What did your folks think about you going to Model UNs and going on car scavenger hunts and dressing up at trees?
My parents, my mom particularly, was really supportive. My mom was very bookish. She had a library, a huge wall of books in our house growing up. She had read pretty widely herself, including a lot of historical fiction. So she was no stranger to Lady Jane Grey or Anne Boleyn or Henry VIII, for that matter. So there was a lot of that going on in the house. She was a big reader. I think she was kind of entertained that I was entertained by that stuff. That she had, in that wall of books that she had, there were a couple of different encyclopedias, and I used to pore over those, reading articles. They had great illustrations, maps, and coats of arms, heraldry, jousting, all that stuff. Some of my first exposure to that was through my mom's books, and so I'm actually very grateful for that. And my dad, I think he was amused that I was finally, meeting girls.
Did you have any siblings that you recruited to be participants in these endeavors?
I was the eldest of four. I had a younger brother followed by twin sisters. My brother got into Dungeons and Dragons with us and everything, but I think he liked to kind of go his own way. He didn't want me lording my big brotherness over him. But my mom's house was the place where we all met to play Dungeons and Dragons before I started going to Caltech to do that, or UCLA to do that. There was a dining room table and there was a patio table, and David, my brother, and I would kind of gravitate to one or the other of those, and we did not often play the same game at the same time.
So, what brought you out to the Renaissance Pleasure Fair for that very first time?
The banner contest. They had a parade where they had all these banners that people had made, and I made a heraldic banner, and I threw together a penny pincher costume from that handout that the fair gave about how to make your penny pincher costume. My brother David came with me that day.
You mentioned something about modifying a burlap sack for your first costume.
Yeah, not like a brand new burlap sack, a used burlap sack that had rice or beans but it was old school burlap, right? It was brown in color. I turned it inside out to get the whatever said rice or beans on it. Do that on the inside and on the back where you're less likely to see it. But I got armholes in it, and I got brown corduroy pants and cut those into cutoffs. And I don't know, I think it was a straw hat or something like that. That banner I made, because of my love of heraldry, dragon on one side, and it had a tree with a crescent moon on the other side. And it was gold and green because those are the Hobbit's favorite colors. And it was a red and dragon on a green background, which breaks a rule of heraldry, but I got away with it. And it looked like something that Knights Templar or somebody would have carried into battle. But it wasn't refined by any means. It was crude. But I got help from family members to sew it together and carry it out there. But it was a nice, fun way to get into the fair for free because Lord knows I couldn't pay full freight those days. So.
And that's how you met Theo? He saw your banner?
No. Theo was my fencing coach at UCLA. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't on the team. I tried out for the Sabre team, and I met Coach Ganchev. This guy was the real deal. He was a serious fencer. I tried to be a walk-on on the team. I wasn't recruited for it, and he wouldn't have it. But that's okay, because Theo Katzoff would happily teach me foil as part of the recreation program. And Ted's a fine coach. So I learned a lot from Ted about fencing. I really enjoyed fencing all through my life until I had a stroke, partially paralyzed after they recovered from the stroke. So no more fencing on my feet. And I thought about wheelchair fencing, but I don't want to spend that much time in a wheelchair.
I'm reading your fair resume sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I like the story about your cousin who talked like Gollum, and that was your entry into Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, my uncle was in the Air Force during the Vietnam era. So I had my aunt and my three cousins couldn't get base housing in a war zone. So they came to live. My mom had a small house, but a big yard. And they came and they lived with us for the duration of my uncle's deployment. And we interacted quite a bit. My cousins were younger than I was. My middle cousin, Patty, was really kind of cute. And she had read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and she'd start pretending she was Gollum, and, in our backyard, like Gollum. And I was like, oh, what is this Gollum you're talking about? So I immediately got my hands on The Hobbit, and I read that first and was sucked into it. And I go, oh, I need more of this. And so I went into The Lord of the Rings right after that and was sucked in deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's just been a passion of mine, like a literary passion ever since. It just, as time went on and Christopher Tolkien, John Tolkien's son, went over his father's unfinished works and turned them into things that were publishable, either for people who wanted more story, like the Silmarillion when it first came out, or just people who were total nerds and not only wanted to know what was in the earlier versions of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings before they were finalized and wanted to know all the variations on a theme in between. Alan Unwin and company made a mint off of all the, but that was, it was the first serious author that had that much supporting documentation. He kept all of that stuff. And so his literary executor, Christopher Tolkien, was able to go through it and sort of manifest books, various versions of the first age and second age stories as they appeared over time. And I collected all of that stuff with the thought that I couldn't get to it while I was working for a living, but it's something to do in retirement. And then, of course, the commercial success of the Lord of the Rings movies really increased the market for that kind of stuff. And now you've got Amazon Prime bringing fan fiction versions of the Silmarillion to subscription television. And those are pretty good.
So how did you get from guy with a homemade banner who liked fencing and got in for free so you could be in a parade to coming back next year or next weekend and actually working there?
So that was Theo, right? I knew, or Ted, some people call him Ted. So Theo Katzoff, my fencing coach, he was also one of the officers of the Tottenham Halberdiers, the famous Keystone Cops of the Renaissance Fair. I was there their second year and part of their third year. When I was there for the banner contest wearing my canvas gunny sack costume, I ran into the Tottenham Halberdier encampment. It was their first year. Theo was there. He was Lieutenant John DeVere to David Springhorn's Edward Wentworth Courage and Pat Bannon's Sergeant Lancelot Blout. So I encountered the Halberdiers that day, and Ted looked at me and my rags and said, "Oh, you've fallen on hard times, haven't you?" I said, "Yeah." He knew I could fence, and we knew each other. I think I might have even been to his house at that point, but he recruited me. He said, "Well, next year when you come back, you should be a Halberdier." And I said, "Sign me up."
What, when you first saw the halberdiers, attracted you and made you say, these are my people, I want to do this?
It was a company. It was a whole theatrical company. Pat Bannon, he was a serious actor, serious professional actor for a long time. And he did his own makeup. And I mean, you've interviewed him, his story. David Springhorn was just a wild man, just brilliant, crazy, quick-witted, funny, bold, irreverent. I can't say enough good things about David, and we've become lifelong friends. What made me want to be a part of that? It's that energy, that craziness. And you could almost get away with anything in those days. It was the 70s, not the 60s, but there was a little pocket of the 60s still at the Renaissance Fair in the 70s. So
do you remember anything that Pat or Theo or David told you as sort of a truism of acting that you still remember and utilize in different parts of your life?
I can say some very wise words that Pat Bannon gave me. Ugga bugga boo. Ugga boo boo ugga. Ugga bugga boo. Ugga boo. There's not much more to add to that.
Well, it's hard to add to that. For instance, I remember we had an exercise in the halberdiers where we were given a premise and everybody just got it into a circle naturally and we're talking across the circle. And David, in his own inimitable way, said, time out, this is crap. You always have to be aware of the audience. Yes. And so he made us all turn around and he really stressed that there is an audience out there. And unless you are interacting with the audience around you, you're not really doing much.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up, because that kind of blocking and that kind of consideration for the patrons or customers of the fair, believe it or not, that was top of mind. Those guys, they knew what they were doing. Not just halberdier workshops, but actual fair workshops brought a lot of that to the mix too, like have a green umbrella, something that's unique about your character that is going to make people wonder and make them want to engage with you.
And give you, with the green umbrella, something you can talk about to 100 people a day going by saying, you like my green umbrella? You like my green umbrella?
Right. After I got a little more confidence in what I was doing, I had my Robin Hood hat, which I made myself out of leather, sewed it together. And, it's a basic, technically they're called bicocket hats, although nobody knew that for a long time, at least not at the fair. But I had sewn mine out of leather in such a way.
I remember your Robin Hood hat.
It was a little bit open at the back. I was inspired by illustrations from Howard Pyle's version of Robin Hood, which he illustrated himself. And there was this big bicocket hat that sat on his back when he wasn't wearing it on his head. And so it was suspended by a leather thong. And so my leather hat was like that. And it was very high crowned, more high crowned than any of the Robin Hood hats you see out there for sale typically. But what turned that leather hat into a thing. And there was a lot of beer sloshing around at the fair all the time, right? And I think Dave Swan, we were on stage singing Oak, Ash, and Thorn, and Ciderman's Fancy were singing together on stage because it was fun. And they had a half hour and we had a half hour, and they were right next to each other, and we just all show up for the first half hour and blow through all the way to the second. But I think Dave Swan figured it out. We always had beer in our hands singing, especially Oak, Ash, and Thorn. And Swan figured out if you poured beer in the back of the bicocket hat, it wouldn't leak because it was leather and it had been waxed. But if I leaned forward, the beer would come out the focal point in the front of the bicocket. And so when we figured that out, it became a regular thing because he would pour beer in the back of my hat. I would lean forward and I would catch it in my tankard, and then I drank it. But we did that on stage quite a bit.
Mark and I developed a prop called Cannonball Light, which was basically a beach ball covered in burlap with a long string attached to it. And Mark would stand up there and we'd have people play tetherball. And since Mark is really tall,
Yeah.
It's a very nice visual to get people to stop. And then I'd be extolling the virtues of Cannonball Light. We were Cannonball Light salesmen. And so we're, demonstrating the lightness of our product. It's so light you can play tetherball with it.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I played around with calligraphy and with invisible ink, and writing things in invisible ink and then putting it in the oven for a few minutes to make it appear. And then when I got big into Tolkien and The Hobbit, I just kind of looked at the map, Thror's map from The Hobbit. I just kind of looked at it and copied it with dipped pens and speedball ink and all that stuff, trying to get that effect. I had a friend at UCLA named Mike Urban, who actually also ended up working at Faire for a while. I dragged him into it. He played the Sham. And Mike was big into Tolkien too. And he and I got into learning Elvish back when that was difficult, because he had been part of the Mythopoeic Society and they had a linguistics group, and he put me in touch with them. We actually arranged for the UCLA Computer Club offered classes to students, usually in COBOL and Fortran and compiler and that kind of stuff. But they actually offered one in Elvish, the language, and we had some fun with that.
I see here in your biography, you got to understudy for Pyramus and Thisbe when David was doing it.
I did. It wasn't a real formal theatrical, you're the understudy kind of thing. It was like, oh my gosh, Kevin Brown, who is playing the narrator. This was at Northern Fair, I think probably 78, maybe 79. But Kevin couldn't make it one weekend. And so, Steve, here, learn these lines and wear Kevin's clothes. So if you ever see me wearing Kevin's costume from Pyramus and Thisbe in a picture on Facebook of the Northern Renaissance Fair, that was that occasion. Even when we weren't in them, we used to come and just watch them because, oh my God, when Thisbe stabbed herself in the watermelon or cantaloupe or whatever it was just hysterical. The audiences loved that. The seeds were flying everywhere, and it was a great show.
It was. And you say here that the Halberdiers had their own singing subgroup of some sort.
Yeah, one of the fun things about the Halberdiers is they met well before workshops to get to know each other and to work things out. And it was a great ensemble cast. There were fun people, and most of whom I'm still in touch with. We would meet before the workshops began and work things out. Well, so the singing group, there were a number of folks in that group who really enjoyed the singing, and we had a sort of minimal practice on minimal singing as part of the main Halberdiers gig. We had songs that we would sing as we were marching along, many of which are R-rated and probably should not be repeated here. But some of us really wanted to keep going with that. Tom Puente and Kate Breckenridge were a couple of those people besides myself. And Fred and Kim Wright were some of the others. We formed a little group to focus on learning more songs so that we could sing. And mostly it was like child ballads that we could copy from, Tim Hart and Matty Pryor, or the Wattersons, or Dirty Ed McCurdy for some of them. I mean, these were all people that were either involved in body songs of the 50s and 60s or the straight up serious folk song revival that was going on in England and Scotland in the late 60s, mid 70s. And, it still continues today.
Can I ask a question before I forget?
Yeah.
Do you have any tapes of like early halberdier singing the Nottingham March?
No, but no, I mean, recording back then was a little bit harder than it is now. By the time I finally got to record in a professional studio here in Berkeley, things had come a long way from there. But Mark got really good at that too, right? He put together his own home studio, and he went really far musically along the Renaissance Fair music line from when I first performed. When he and I were in Halberdiers, he had trained on cello, really hard to walk around the Renaissance Fair carrying a cello. So he took a fiddle and he put it between his legs like it was a very tiny cello. Well, if you find a picture of that where he and I were sitting together with our backs to a tree at the high road at the Southern Renaissance Fair, and he was playing fiddle like a cello, and I was playing percussion by picking up a pair of rocks and banging on the bottom of my pewter cup. That was one of my first musical gigs at the Renaissance Fair.
And look where you are now.
I know, right? Do you remember there was a restaurant called Poppy's Star? It was a full service, real gosh darn restaurant, but its shtick was that all the people that worked there as waiters were entertainers who still hadn't got their first big break. And Mark and I got it in our heads. We were encouraged by people at the fair. Sure, you guys need a job or you need a gig. Go on down to Poppy's Star when they have open auditions and do your act, and you can become waiters. So we did that. We were not selected, but had a good time.
Do you remember what you did to audition?
Yeah, just exactly what I was describing. Mark would play his fiddle like a cello, and I would bang on my upturned pewter cup. I'd had a little bit of training as a drummer, but they were really looking for it. I tell you, who did get the gig was a young woman who sang Irish body ballads really well. She was great. I've only ever talked to Shauna online or on the phone. David Springhorn would put me on the phone with her from time to time because he felt it was important that we meet. I admire the Vardo wagon she's been building from the ground, from scratch. And so good people, all of those guys, good people.
You also danced?
So this is the segue from my first fair as a halberdier to my second fair as a member of a mummers play cast that included sword dancing. So I played the fool. So this was something that Richard Seville was putting together. He was one of the Morris team members. All those original pipe and bowl guys were still dancing pipe and bowl. They needed to fill more stages, and they put together this mummers play, traditional folkloric thing, but something that you can play with and keep fresh. Maybe make topical references that were thinly veiled so that, that's one way to get audience engagement, to make sly political jokes. So Richard Seville had written this mummers play. Tom Puente and I were both really impressed by Pipe and Bowl Morris team and the Brunos. So Richard said, well, I'll teach you guys how to Morris dance and sword dance just by being my play. And so I loved it. I did. We auditioned, and I was typecast as the fool. This is a ritual play where the fool represents John Barleycorn, who ritually gets his head cut off, resurrected as homebrewed beer. So I learned how to dance with the sword. But in the play, I wasn't one of the sword dancers. I was fool that was getting his head chopped off, very symbolically. If you're ever going to be a sword dancer, when you do a sword lock, and the style we were dancing, there were 6 dancers, 6 swords in the sword lock. And as they were dancing around me in a circle, at one point they form a sword lock and they hold it up high, and it looks kind of like the Star of David, only with little handles and stuff coming out at the end. And they will hold that over my head. And then when it came time to execute the fool, they would break the sword lock, everybody by pulling their own sword out of the lock by the handle. Well, if you put the sword lock over the head the right way, when you break the sword lock, the swords go down. If you put it on the wrong way, when you break the sword lock, the swords go up. And one day they did it the wrong way, and I got hit in my front tooth, chipped my tooth, but the show must go on. So we finished the performance. Fortunately, there was a Morse dancer out there with some wits about him who picked up my broken tooth and saved it for me on ice until I could go get it glued back on the next day.
But the sword lock was done sort of at your neck, and they're supposed to take the swords away, and that is supposed to be representing your head getting cut off.
Yeah. And if you hold the swords the right way, the swords go down when you break the lock. If you hold it the wrong way, they go up. So that's how my tooth got chipped that day. But it's a badge of honor. They never did it the wrong way again, to my knowledge, at least not with me in the center.
If some great god of the fair was to say to you, you can only sing or you can only dance, which would you choose?
I wanted to do it all. I can't choose. It's like, who's your favorite kid? You can't make that choice. Or, I mean, it's not like your favorite beer. You can choose a favorite beer, but only one favorite beer for the rest. But, I will say that it was an evolution, and halberdiers got me interested in the acting part of it, and the audience engagement part of it was great in the halberdiers. And it got me out of my shell, because I was a little bit of an introvert growing up. So the acting part had a lot to offer. And I didn't just walk away from it because I lost interest. I walked away from it because David Springhorn stopped doing it. He got a job doing court or something like that. So David wasn't there anymore. And I wanted to keep on with the halberdiers, but I also really wanted to get involved with Morris dancing, with the Richard Seville connection, and Farmer. His real name was Bob, but we all called him Farmer. Even Doug. And there's a story about me and Doug, because he was squire of the Morris team and I was a wannabe, and the Morris team was the gang and I was a wannabe, and it took a while to break into the gang. But you were asking back to the main point, which is me choosing between acting and dancing and singing. I wanted it all, but I couldn't have it all at once. I had to do it sequentially. So halberdiers, I learned how to act and come out of my shell and engage with the audience and have a hell of a good time doing it. And then Pipe and Bowl and the Mummers teams that were spun off from Pipe and Bowl, and then later on Sunset Morris team, and then back to Pipe and Bowl. That was how I got to learn how to dance, how to do the folk dancing. And also, I also would dance. The Pipe and Bowl guys would also dance in the co-ed dances, the country dances that Newcastle did. So that was a fun way to engage with people socially as well, because when you're reenacting, it's not just acting. You're not just playing a character. You're also yourself, right, the whole time. If you're in a dance that's a performative dance, great, the audience is getting something out of it, but you're getting something out of it too, right? If you're doing a circle dance and you're curtsying to your partner and all that stuff, that's an experience in and of itself, apart from the performance.
That brings up an interesting point, at least to me. It seems there's something special about your performance art in that you've never said, and I'm putting words in your brain. You don't seem to have the arc of somebody who said, I'm going to be a star someday, but rather I want to create an environment that I can play in.
Yeah.
And be a character in. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. I mean, look, over the years, I loved becoming the center of attention. When it was my turn, I ate it up. Come on, I'm a ham, right? And I think I got a little bit of that from my dad, who was a raconteur in his own right, storyteller, but only face to face.
Was he into sales?
Yeah, he was a very talented bowler, bowling balls and pins and stuff like that,
Hmm.
as a kid growing up. And he worked organizing bowling leagues and being kind of the life of the party at the tournaments and that sort of stuff for the longest time. And then he went into sales. He made decent money for a little while, but go watch Death of a Salesman. That's a tough way to make a living. And so there was boom cycles and bust cycles. And I knew that I did not want to go into sales. I became a people person at the fair. I don't want to convince anybody to do anything except have a good time.
Right.
So I knew that wasn't for me.
And your mom was a more introverted reader.
My mom, I think I mentioned I had 3 siblings. So there were 4 kids, 2 parents. Dad managed. He was in the Korean conflict in the army. We used to live in Santa Monica. He used the GI Bill to buy a house in the valley where I grew up. He did have a good boom cycle one year that was good enough to afford us a swimming pool, a custom dug-in swimming pool. So that we had a little oasis there for a while.
Where in the valley did you live?
I could tell you, but it kept changing its name. When I was a kid, it was called Sepulveda. And then at some point, the people that lived there decided, I think, that they wanted to increase their property values by changing it from a Hispanic sounding name to an English sounding name. So they came up with North Hills for that part of Sepulveda. And so at some point, they either changed the name of Northridge to North Hills or North Hills to Northridge. So that I lived in Sepulveda, North Hills, and Northridge at various points in my life, but I never moved during that time, right? The thing about that part of Sepulveda, the public high school we were all fed into was James Monroe. And I had a great time in high school. I was a bit of a nerd, but I was a nerd who liked to explore things. So I was in student council for a while. I was in the Shakespeare Club. I actually decided I wanted formal music lessons. At one point, I had a bunch of friends in band, and I knew a lot about classical music. So I was on the Knowledge Bowl on KFAC. They came out, put an ad in the school newspaper saying, hey, we're looking for people who know a lot about classical music to play on a game show on KFAC. A game show that's basically Knowledge Bowl, but for music. Well, I loved classical music, and my friend Craig Kerner loved classical music. And in fact, we used to find the greatest LPs that we could. We would pretend that we were conducting stereo orchestra, but the music department chair found out about that, and he said, where have you guys been hiding? We played a couple of music bowls on the radio, and we did pretty well and got invited back. And Gerald Miller, who was the chair of the music department, he had a daughter, Michelle, in my grade. We were in some classes together, but Gerald was like, where have you guys been hiding? And I said, well, we don't play any instrument. We play the stereo. And he said, well, I'm going to fix that. He went back to the curriculum and he added a couple of classes. Piano for beginners. The music clique in high school is people that have been taking lessons for years. I was not in that demographic. So that was my first exposure to formal musical training, apart from 6 weeks of lessons I got with the guitar my mom bought for me when I was 12. That was all the formal training I had up until high school, yeah.
Obviously, this whole sort of immersive acting, creating an environment thing is a big part of you. Have you ever used any skills from that part of your life in your quote unquote real life?
Yeah, and I can articulate some of that, but I want to make a philosophical point about the work life, recreational life dichotomy. And the philosophical point is, don't do that. There's a book out there that I read a long time ago, Do What You Love and the Money Will Follow. Well, okay, maybe not, because not everybody can make a living as an actor or a singer or a dancer. But, flip it on its head. Do what you love, but love what you do, right? And don't compartmentalize yourself. That's some of the advice I would give to people. I'm a fair person. I will always be a fair person, even though I've retired from performing at fair. I still go there. I still have fun. And I am not defined by my career, which was in information systems and information technology.
That's a really good point. Um, but were there like skills you got at fair that you're able to use in other parts of your life?
You have to be able to think on your feet. And nothing prepares you better for that than doing improvisational theater in front of hundreds of people. It doesn't matter whether it's theater or running a business systems design workshop. It doesn't matter, as it turns out. But also try to have fun wherever you are, whoever you're with. It's not always easy in business, but find your people. I was surprised by how many fair folks, SC80ans, I encountered in the real world. And try to build community. The show stands or falls by the give and take with and amongst the cast or your colleagues, and stay true to your nature. I tried taking sustainability courses, recognizing in the data that Al Gore presented that it wasn't wrong, but I couldn't pivot away from IS in any sensible way during my career. And I'm not an activist at heart. I'm still finding my voice and my place in the world.
When you talk about working in a small group and trying to create a fun team, let's get this done, guys. Have there been specific instances in fair where you've created or been part of a small group creating a common product kind of thing, like a singing group or something?
What comes to mind when you put it that way is the last thing I was involved with seriously musically was the Dogwatch Nautical Band, which was the sea shanty group at the Dickens Fair for many years before the Sea Dogs took over. And we recorded an album. I had always wanted to record an album. I left Siderman's Fancy just at the time they began seriously recording an album. So I missed out on being part of Siderman's Fancy's album. Regretted that. And then I had started another group with my wife and Roger Bramble and Molly Breen, who is now Melody Burke. We started another group called Jolly Beggar. And we did that for a few years until Lori got pregnant with our first kid. And then she and I decided, fair breaths notwithstanding, we just couldn't handle 2 careers and raising children and working the Renaissance Fair. So she missed out. My first kid missed out on her opportunity to be a fair brat, which they never forgave me for. But Jolly Beggar recorded a tape after Lori and I went out to have kids. They got to keep the name. They were very grateful to carry on the tradition. They made an album a year or 2 down the line from Lori and I stopping. So there was 2 bands I was in that both recorded professionally, and I didn't get to be a part of that. And so I really had on my bucket list, I got to make an album someday. And my friend Gary Keep and my friend Roger Bramble had joined the Dogwatch Nautical Band. They were saying how much fun it was. And Jenny, who I sang with at Siderman's Fancy, she was an off and on member of Dogwatch as well. So they invited me to come back and sing with them. I said, okay, let's make an album, because I'd never had a chance to make an album. And Dogwatch, it's not like we were top 40 or anything or ever will be, but we were pretty good. And we would perform, we'd get paid when we perform. Now, when you're got 6 people in your band, check for performing at a party, or a lot of times it was at High Street Pier at the Maritime Museum. Those checks don't stretch very far when you're splitting them up 6 ways. So we decided we would pool our money until we had enough money to make an album. I was learning as I went along, but I wanted it bad. I wanted it the most. So I was willing to take on the cat herding, the musician wrangling, along with Shira Common, who's a very talented musician that Shea Black knew and brought into the project to kind of co-produce it with me. And Shira brought the musical ear and the knowledge of the recording process, along with Derek Bianchi, our engineer, who had a studio in Berkeley, great guy. Kind of went through all of the stuff you see in the movies about making an album together, when you don't all have the same exact artistic vision. We went through a lot of that. And so it took years to do the cat herding and the musician wrangling to actually finally produce an album, but we did. And I think it came out pretty good.
What were some of the techniques to get everybody close enough to being on the same page that you could move forward?
So there you go. You asked the right question, because now I see where the theme of fair folk at work comes in. Because my skills as a systems analyst doing requirements gathering, those were very much directly applicable to the creative process behind making an album. Just the very beginning is like, okay, we know a lot of songs and we all have our own favorites. There's only room for so many songs on an album. How are we going to pick which songs go on the album? Let's look at our material. Let's did this like an information systems engineering project where we said, let's get a big piece of paper and tape it to the wall, and we'll write all the names of all the songs we know on there, and we'll get out some hot dots. And everybody gets 6 hot dots they get to put up there, and you put your hot dots on the songs you want to record most. You can put 6 hot dots on one song, or you can put 1 hot dot on one song, or anywhere in between, but you only get 6. And so that's a really quick way to get a list of 30 songs you might do down to a list of 10 or 11 that you can actually afford to put on an album. And also just execution. It's like, okay, recording an album is a series of tasks. And not everybody has to be there for every task. And in fact, it may not be very effective for everybody to be there for every task. You got 3 people twiddling their thumbs while one person records a solo. So figuring out who needed to be scheduling the recording sessions, basically. That's just project management 101. But not everybody on the band had that skill. So that's one of the things I did.
Can I reverse the question? Are there times when you relied upon knowledge at Fair to move a non-fair project forward?
That's a bit of a puzzler. I'm probably, I don't know, be your own self. That was when I first went into business, it was so far from my self-image. I didn't really expect to go start working as a computer programmer. It's not what I was training for. I was studying history for fun with the thinking that, well, it was going to be a good preparation for law school. And then, I had a lot of fun at school and at the fair, but I didn't really have, law school got real competitive real fast. And I didn't have the kind of grades I needed to get into top tier law school. And my mom was a paralegal, and talked to her employer, and he's like, do you want to work really hard and get into law school? And I'm like, no, I want to keep having fun. I want to do things that are fun. So I kind of gave up on my law career, and the relevance of my history degree evaporated about the time I was a senior at UCLA. Well, they had something at that time called the UCLA writing program, which was a special project from the chancellor's office to try to salvage the marketability of liberal arts majors. And one of the things they had, I had taken a lot of English classes as a consequence of being interested in folklore and mythology. All those classes were cross-listed with Scandinavian languages or Finnish languages or Irish language, or, they're all cross-listed, but I took English courses because I thought that was more respectable on a resume. But one of the English courses that was really tailored to my needs was this thing. It's like, so you're a liberal arts major and you want to get a job, or you're an English major and you want to get a job. How about becoming a proofreader or a copy editor or a writer, a journalist? We had this boot camp at UCLA where you could turn out pretty decent copy editors in 6 months. So I did that. And I was fully expecting to go for my first job to be a copy editing job. But you don't get jobs necessarily from preparing academically for them. You get them by networking. And at that time, there was so much demand for computer programmers. You didn't have to have, I had a little computer science and a little bit of engineering at UCLA just for fun. I was hanging out with computer science majors because they were fun people. They were nerds like me. They like to do car rally. They like to play Dungeons and Dragons. And so that's how I knew all the computer club guys. But I took logic, I took programming in C. So I landed a job through networking, not based on my skills as a copy editor, but based on my potential as a future programmer. That's what I ended up doing for 40 years of my life.
I
But
notice here in your essay/resume that you have sort of come full circle and are taking writing classes once again.
yeah, it's my first love. I love the fair, and I loved all the folklore and mythology that I took at UCLA. And I loved Tolkien, and it was all based on Scandinavian mythology in part. I mean, it was very inventive, but that scene where Bilbo encounters Smaug, it's straight out of Beowulf. It's just a mild rewriting of Beowulf, but it was awesome.
What are you writing?
So I'm taking online classes from a school called the Carter Haas School of Folklore and the Fantastic. I've been doing it for at least a couple of years now, and it's very smorgasbord. You're not getting academic credits for this. It's a school for people who want to have fun at school, want to take the studies seriously, but not necessarily,
With
go
an
through.
expectation of it being a career?
Yeah, I mean, I had earned my master's degree very late in life in information systems, and I didn't need to go back to school to learn folklore. I just want to have fun, right? Like I did at the fair. So Carter Hall appealed to me for a couple of reasons. It was all online. There was a pandemic going on, and the talent of the PhDs who run this program, there's a couple of them, they're just brilliant. They're really smart. They're really good at what they do. I continue to take classes from them when they hit my sweet spot in terms of timing and availability, interest. Some of their classes are geared towards helping people develop writing projects of their own that may or may not be influenced by folklore or fantasy writing. Getting a lot of kudos from my experiences in those classes. And they've published a very short work that I wrote a while back. They published on their website that brings in a lot of folkloric stuff that I like to grow apples as a hobby. And I have a piece that I wrote about the trauma I experienced growing up around apple trees that got cut down. But the joy and the community I found by growing apples and pressing those apples into cider and fermenting it in my backyard.
And this is a programming note. I have another podcast called Authors Read, and I'd like to have you read that story there.
Yeah.
Just,
I definitely, they got, Carter Haw had first publication rights, but they said the copyright rests with me. And then if I wanted to use it again in another project, I was welcome to do so. So I would love to read that poem on your other show.
For listeners of Fair Folk at Work, look wherever you saw this podcast mentioned, look for another podcast called Authors Reads and an episode called Steve Sings with Dogwatch Says His Essay by Himself. So at any rate, I find it interesting that your renaissance of creativity has happened after you've had a stroke.
I had a massive hemorrhagic stroke.
Okay.
Like a week before my 35th birthday. I fortunately was working at a company that had great benefits, and I went on disability at like almost full pay for a year, and disability at like half pay-ish. I don't remember. It was a long time ago, for another 6 months. And then, thanks to the Americans with Disabilities Act, I'm sure my Fortune 500 employer felt a great deal of responsibility for helping me return to the workforce. So I got all kinds of accommodations for about my first year back at work. Was able to go back to doing really complicated things, with coping strategies. One of the things I learned is that every stroke is unique. Injury to your brain, it matters which part of your brain it was in. It matters how big an injury it was? Is it enough to recover from? And although one of the things I had difficulty with was, over the years was, word finding. I still have difficulty with word finding, but was differentiating mental decay, this root cause. Is it stroke related, or is it just, am I just getting older?
Right.
And fortunately, you could pose that question to people that knew you, speech pathologists or physical therapists or neuropsychologists. And then I volunteered to be a subject in some neurological research studies that were being conducted by a neighbor who was also a PhD in neuroscience. And she was doing experiments at the VA that were very cleverly designed without violating any kind of ethics problems. If you have somebody who already has brain damage and you can test their ability, it's sort of an after the fact experiments. Hey, what happens if I damage this part of the brain? So you can look at lots of different brains that are damaged in lots of different ways, and you can start to correlate functionality with various regions of the brain. But one of the things they've learned is that if you overwhelm a region of the brain, my stroke was a hemorrhagic stroke, so it was a flood, or a sort of a suffocating stroke, an ischemic stroke, where blood does not get to a part of your brain and that part of that tissue dies. But if you can correlate somebody's neurological deficits with the damaged sections of the brain, then you can start to ascribe certain functionality in a typical human brain with a certain region of that brain. And it's complicated by a couple of things: the type of the stroke, the location of the functionality in your brain. And it turns out probably that everybody's brain is a little bit different. They tend to put certain kinds of functionalities in certain kind of ways, but your brains develop as you learn things and grow. So not every brain puts everything in the same place exactly. But also they've done experiments with mice and so on, teaching mice to run a maze and then cutting out half their brain, and the mice can still run the maze. And so then they cut out another quarter of the brain and the mice can still run the maze. But if you take out 3/4 of the brain all at once, the mice can't run the maze anymore because you got the location of that skill set. I don't know, fascinating stuff.
Let's get back to the faire stuff.
Sure.
As we've been going along, have you thought of something that you hadn't thought of before that you want to get in? And
oh, well, we were talking about who did you notice at faire and say, I want to do what they're doing? And so I had 3 broad points. I wanted to play and belong. So I wanted to do the acting thing. And then I wanted to dance. And we talked about the acting thing and we talked about dancing, but I wanted to sing.
who do you remember, and what about their performance? I want to do that.
Oak, Ash, and Thorn. Without a doubt, it was Oak, Ash, and Thorn.
Is there a favorite Oak, Ash, and Thorn moment or song that springs to mind?
Well, so many of them were so good, but I think one of my favorites was Fathom the Bowl. And then Barley Mow, quart pot, pint pot, half a pint, jilt pot, half a jilt, quarter jilt, never get in the brown bowl, that stuff. Loved it. Oak, Ash, and Thorn were gods. Those harmonies, that songbook, the conviviality. Conviviality was a carefully chosen word because these guys were cultivated. If you ever saw them do their shtick at a venue apart from Dickens or apart from the Renaissance Fair, they were like a bunch of English upper class gentlemen from the pub, and they were really good at it. But so I wanted to be like them. My good friends, John Berger and Jenny Beilhardt, I know John was playing fiddle for the Morris team at the time. And I was kind of ready to do the next thing. I was done some Morris dancing with Pipe and Bowl. I'd done some Morris dancing with Sunset at Southern Fair, and I was kind of ready to move on. And I was just loving listening to Oak, Ash, and Thorn. So John was playing for Pipe and Bowl, and Jenny and John were kind of a couple at that point. And we all of us decided at the same time we wanted to be like Oat, but John and Jenny played musical instruments, so they wanted to include the instruments. I said, play instruments, but I can be funny on stage and I can harmonize. I can sing lead or I can not sing lead. So they went up to the Vancouver Folk Music Festival one year and came back with a bunch of songs. Stan Rogers for one, Eric Bogle for another, and they came back with a love of cider because BC cider is a thing. So we formed a band and we called it Ciderman's Fancy, which sounded both like the name of a fiddle tune and like the name of something you could drink. And we ended up sharing the stage with Oak Ash and Thorn quite a bit. So in a way, I did end up singing with them, but just as part of these supersets where you had Oak Ash and Thorn and Ciderman's Fancy jamming together. And we would take over the Caravansary stage at Northern Fair and just, go for a full hour and just have a great time. Jenny had fun being the only female in the group and getting a lot of attention from other members of the group in terms of stage presence and focus, that sort of thing. Nothing untoward, but really, really, really good times. And then eventually I left Ciderman's about the same time that Gary Keep joined the band and Morgan.
What was your favorite Ciderman's Fancy song?
So many of those songs are public domain. And so Oak, Ash and Thorn and Ciderman's Fancy would both sing those songs, even if the other band wasn't there. But I liked the more traditional stuff, the older stuff, the stuff that truly belonged at Fair. We did do more, Ilkamore Batat, which is like the famous Yorkshireman's song. It's like if you sing Ilkamore Batat, you're definitely from Yorkshire, because nobody else even knows what it means, right? If you're not from Yorkshire, you don't know that it means you're up at this place called Ilkamore without your hat. I highly recommend going to YouTube, Googling Ilkamore Batat, and watching the Yorkshire Tourism Board's mashup of all these different people singing it together, including Brian Blessed and other people you will recognize. But it's a very funny song in dialect about cannibalism. And so that was one of my favorite songs. It is a traditional song. It's maybe not as old as some of the others that we used to do, but that one I think was particular to Ciderman's and not one we shared with Oak Ash and Thorn. But good luck to the Pine Pot, good luck to the Barley Mow. Loved that one. I do want to mention one other band, and that's after I left Ciderman's. Lori, my wife, and I, and Roger Bramble, who I would later sing with in Dogwatch, but hadn't done that yet, and Molly Breen at the time, now Molly Burke or Melody Burke, we formed Jolly Beggar. Lori had been singing with Lois DeArmond, and Joyce, Nonamaker McCall, and others from the Britain Ensemble. So they were real musicians, and they brought a lot of musicality. Lori brought a lot of musicality to what we did, and we just brought the fun and the goofiness, and we cooked up this whole thing where my character, who went by the name Dickon Codling, which was a name that Springhorn gave me at my first fair, which was prophetic in some ways. And Springhorn sang with us once in a while too, but we formed this group called Jolly Beggar, and we did all the fun stuff. And Dickon, he became famous for his love of sheep, and so there was a lot of broad humor around that. That was the most fun I ever had at fair, was doing that, doing silly, funny, rustic, peasant level folk music with my wife and some of my best friends. And
singing, friends, fair, fun, sheep and David. What better way to end another Fair Folk at Work interview with my good friend Steve Aultman, recorded in July of 2023. And be sure to check out my sister podcast, Authors Reads, for the episode entitled Steve Aultman Sings with Dogwatch, says his essay by himself. And you will hear him singing and doing that. If you have questions or comments you'd like to pass along to Steve, feel free to give them to me at djng@earthlink.net. If you would like to participate in Fair Folk at Work, please contact me at djng@earthlink.net. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.